Brandon Whitmore tapped his champagne glass with a silver ring, and the sound cut through 300 conversations like a blade. He didn't need a microphone. Men like Brandon never did. "I just want to take a moment," he said, smiling at the crowd with that particular smile, the one that looked generous and wasn't, to acknowledge someone very special who's here tonight. He turned, found Charlotte in the crowd, and pointed. "My ex-girlfriend, Charlotte Hayes, elementary school teacher." He let that land. "Still not married." The laughter started soft. Then it spread. Charlotte's champagne glass was cold in her hand. She didn't move. Brandon wasn't finished. He never was. "Charlotte used to tell me she didn't care about money." Another sip. "Turns out she just never had any." 300 people. Some laughed. Some looked away. Some watched Charlotte the way people watch something falling. Not to catch it, just to see where it lands. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely alone, if you've ever smiled while something inside you was breaking, then you already know exactly where Charlotte was standing. And if you've ever wished, in that exact moment, that someone would walk through that door and change everything, well, keep watching. Because someone did. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, please hit that like button right now. It tells me the story is reaching you. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that ballroom, because the night is just getting started. Charlotte had worn the blue dress because her mother told her it brought out her eyes. That was the kind of advice that made sense in the afternoon, in a kitchen that smelled like coffee, when the evening still felt manageable. It made less sense now, standing at the edge of the Blackstone Hotel's grand ballroom while 300 people laughed at her ex-boyfriend's joke at her expense. She kept her face neutral. It was a skill she'd developed in 14 years of teaching second grade, the ability to hold still while something loud and ugly happened nearby. She'd gotten good at it. She was very good at it tonight. The ballroom was the kind of room that existed to make ordinary people feel small. 30-foot ceilings. Chandeliers that cost more than her car. Waitstaff moving through the crowd like current, silver trays balanced at shoulder height, champagne refilling automatically so no one ever had to ask. Charlotte's cousin Diane had told her the engagement party would be intimate. Diane's version of intimate included a string quartet and a raw bar. Charlotte hadn't wanted to come. She'd said that to her mother 3 times in the 2 weeks since Diane sent the invitation. Her mother had said each time with quiet certainty, "You're going. Your father would have gone." Richard Hayes had been dead for 4 months. His absence was still the loudest thing in every room Charlotte entered, so she had put on the blue dress, driven 40 minutes into the city, handed her coat to a man in a white glove, and walked into a party full of people who knew exactly how much everything cost and made sure you knew they knew. She'd done fine for the first hour. She knew how to make small talk. She taught children for a living. She could handle adults. She'd spoken to Diane's mother about the centerpieces. She'd declined a second glass of champagne. She'd stood near a window and watched the city lights and thought about her father and kept it contained, the grief sitting low and quiet behind her sternum where she'd learned to keep it. Then Brandon walked in. She'd known he might be there. Diane's family and the Whitmores moved in overlapping circles. She'd told herself it wouldn't matter. She'd told herself it had been 2 years and she was over it, and he was just a person she'd once known. She was wrong about all 3 things. Brandon Whitmore at 34 was exactly what he'd been at 28, tall, easy in his body, born into the particular confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and the kind of suit that whispered money without shouting it. He'd walked in with 2 men she didn't recognize, shaken hands with Diane's fiancé, and then scanned the room the way he always scanned rooms, cataloging, assessing, until his eyes found her. He'd smiled. Not cruelly, not yet. Just the way you smile when you find something interesting. She'd looked away first. She always looked away first. She'd thought, I can survive this. 2 hours. I'll stay for dinner. I'll congratulate Diane. I'll drive home and make tea, and that will be the end of it. She'd made it through dinner. She'd managed the seating arrangement, which placed her 3 tables away from him, close enough to see him work the room, but far enough to pretend she wasn't watching. She'd eaten the salmon. She'd applauded the toasts. She'd told the woman beside her, a corporate attorney named Patricia with extremely good posture, that yes, she loved teaching. No, it wasn't for everyone. Yes, The summers were wonderful. She'd been so close to the end of the night. Then Brandon tapped his glass. The sound of silver on crystal traveled through the room like a tuning fork. Conversations paused. The string quartet in the corner stopped between notes. 300 people turned to look at the man who owned the sound. Brandon smiled at the attention the way a plant smiles at sun, automatically, because that was simply what he required. "I want to say a few words about love," he started, and the room gave him the affectionate attention that handsome men in expensive suits reliably receive at parties. "Diane, Connor, what you two have built is real. I know real, because I know what it looks like when it's missing." A pause. The actor's pause. She recognized it. "Some of us," he said, and his eyes found Charlotte across the room, "spend a long time figuring out what we actually want, what we actually deserve." Another smile, warmer for the crowd, cooler for her. "I spent 3 years with someone who was perfectly nice. Perfectly," a small, almost apologetic shrug. "Ordinary." The word hit like something dropped. Ordinary. He said it without venom, which was worse. He said it like a fact. Like weather. Like something no reasonable person could argue with. "Charlotte Hayes." He raised his glass slightly in her direction. "Elementary school teacher. Heart of gold. A beat. Still not married." The laughter was the worst thing. Not cruel laughter that she could have handled. This was the laughter of people who didn't think it was a big deal. Comfortable laughter. The kind that says, "This is a small joke at someone else's expense. And isn't that fine?" Charlotte did not move. Her champagne glass was in her right hand. She was aware of the weight of it. She was aware of the specific quality of stillness that had come over the people nearest her. The not quite looking. The polite pretending not to notice that she'd been singled out for this. "Turns out," Brandon continued, warming to the room now, "she didn't care about money. She always said so." He smiled and it reached his eyes, which made it worse. "Guess she just never had any to care about." 300 people. Some laughed. Some studied their champagne. A few looked at Charlotte with something that might have been sympathy and might have been relief that they weren't her. The woman beside her, Patricia, the corporate attorney, made a very small sound. Not quite a word. Just the sound a person makes when they witness something unkind and don't know what to do about it. Charlotte thought, "My father would know what to say right now." Then she thought, "My father is dead." Then she thought, "I am not going to cry in this ballroom." She set her champagne glass on the nearest tray with a care that surprised her. Her hand was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. She picked up her small clutch from the table. She turned toward the doors. She kept her chin up. 14 years of standing at the front of a classroom had taught her that. The particular posture that says, "I am in control of this room, even when you are not sure you are." She walked like she was leaving because she had somewhere better to be. She walked like she'd made a decision instead of fleeing. She'd almost made it. The doors were 20 feet away, then 15. She could see the brass handles. She could see the lobby through the gap. The quieter light, the potted plants, the absence of 300 people who just watched her be described as ordinary and not worth keeping. 10 feet. The doors swung open, not from the outside, not pushed by a member of the staff. They swung open the way doors open when someone intends them to open, with a weight and a certainty that made people step back without being asked. Charlotte stopped. The man who walked in was not someone she recognized, but she recognized the effect he had, the way the air in the room changed, the way conversations didn't just pause but stopped entirely, the way people seemed to recalibrate without knowing they were doing it. It moved through the ballroom like a pressure shift before a storm. He was not the tallest man in the room. He was not dressed differently from a dozen other men there. But he moved through the space like it had already been cleared for him, 3 steps ahead of 2 men who flanked him without being told to, who watched the room with the specific alertness of people whose job was to notice everything. He was somewhere in his late 30s. Dark hair. A stillness about him that wasn't passivity. It was the stillness of someone who never moved without reason. His eyes found the room with the quiet efficiency of a person who walks into unfamiliar spaces and immediately knows where every exit is. Those eyes found Charlotte. He crossed the ballroom. Not the room. Not the party. Not Brandon Whitmore, who stood with his champagne raised in a frozen sort of confusion, or Diane and Connor at the center table, or anyone else who turned to watch the new arrival. He walked to Charlotte. Direct. No hesitation. Like someone who had looked at a map 1,000 times and finally reached the destination. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the precise way he held himself. The careful, controlled quality of a person who chose every movement. He was 6 feet, maybe a little over. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they met hers, were gray-green and very direct. He reached out, slowly enough that it wasn't startling, and placed 2 fingers beneath her chin. Not to force her to look up, just enough contact that she felt it, the slightest lift, and found herself meeting his eyes. Then he pressed his lips to her forehead. Brief. Quiet. Not a performance. That was the thing she'd remember later, the thing that didn't make sense for the longest time. It didn't feel like theater. It felt like something private that happened to have an audience. He pulled back. His hand dropped. He turned to face the room. 300 people stood completely still. "She's my wife," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need volume. The room was so quiet that 300 people heard it the way they'd have heard a pin drop. The silence that followed was the kind Charlotte had only ever read about in books. Complete, total, with a quality of held breath that felt almost physical. Even the waitstaff had stopped. Brandon Whitmore's champagne glass was in his hand and he'd forgotten he was holding it. Charlotte did not move, did not speak, did not know what her face was doing, and was suddenly aware that 300 people were watching it to find out. She thought, "I do not know this man." She thought, "He said wife." She thought, his hand is still close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. "My apologies for arriving late," the man said, to no one in particular, to all of them. His voice was even, unhurried. "Charlotte!" He said her name like he'd said it many times before, with a familiarity that landed like a fact in the room. He held out his hand. She took it. She didn't decide to. Her hand just moved. Later she would think about that, the way her body made the decision before her mind did, something in the steadiness of him that registered as safe, even when nothing about the situation was remotely safe. His hand was warm, his grip was light. He didn't pull. He simply held and let her choose whether to move. She moved. The string quartet, after a long moment that felt much longer, began to play again. Conversation slowly, carefully, restarted around the edges of the room, the way water finds its way around an obstacle. But there was a different quality to those conversations now. Lower, faster, urgent, with the specific energy of 300 people quietly trying to understand what had just happened. Charlotte let herself be guided gently away from the center of the room, toward the quieter edges, toward a corner that his people had somehow already cleared without anyone seeing them do it. Her heart was going very fast. She kept her face still. She was good at that. "You don't know me," she said quietly, when they were far enough from the nearest person. Not a question, a statement of fact, because she was a person who preferred facts, even when the facts were deeply confusing. "No," he said. He was watching the room, not aggressively, just watching. "You don't know me either. You just told 300 people I'm your wife." "Yes." "I'm not your wife." "No," he said. "You're not." He paused. "Not yet." She stared at him. I was still watching the room, the same easy, measuring attention, like a man who was simultaneously in a conversation and also doing 17 other things she couldn't see. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "It will," he said. He glanced at her then, briefly, and there was something in it, not quite apology, not quite comfort, but something that acknowledged she was a person who deserved a real answer. "Not here, not tonight, but it will." She should leave. She knew she should leave. The rational thing, the sane thing, was to remove her hand from this man's grip, walk through those brass doors, drive home, make tea, and call Diane in the morning to apologize for whatever had just happened. She knew this. She also knew that Brandon Whitmore was standing 40 feet away, and he was no longer smiling. He was looking at the man beside Charlotte with something on his face she'd never seen there before. Brandon Whitmore, who had never feared anything, was afraid. She didn't know this man beside her. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what he was, or why he'd walked through those doors, or what he'd meant when he said not yet. But she looked at Brandon's face and understood, in some quiet and animal part of her that didn't need evidence to draw conclusions, that whatever her father had uncovered before he died, whatever had gotten him killed, This man knew what it was. She didn't leave. She stood beside him and waited, and the string quartet played and 300 people whispered, and somewhere across the ballroom Brandon Whitmore took out his phone and stepped toward the exit. His name, she would learn in the next 10 minutes, was Damian Moretti. She had heard the name. Everyone in Chicago had heard the name, the way you hear about certain weather systems before they arrive, in warnings, in other people's lowered voices. She held his hand in the grand ballroom of the Blackstone Hotel, and her father's watch was on her wrist, the one she'd worn every day since they buried him, and she thought, "Dad, what did you get me into?" She thought, "I'm going to find out." They left through a side door Charlotte hadn't noticed existed. One of Damian's men, the taller one, with a scar along his left jaw that he'd stopped trying to hide, opened it from the inside while the other stayed close without crowding her, which she noted without knowing why she noted it. They moved through a service corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and warm bread from the kitchen below, and then through a door marked private that opened without a key because someone had already unlocked it, and then they were in a smaller room off the lobby, a meeting room, the kind hotels kept for corporate clients, with a rectangular table and a credenza and lighting that was too bright and too cold after the amber warmth of the ballroom. Damian released her hand. She hadn't realized she was still holding his until he let go. She put 3 feet between them immediately. Not dramatically. Just moved to the other side of the table, which put furniture between her and a man she still did not know, in a room she'd been guided into without quite agreeing to enter. She was a second-grade teacher from the North Side. She'd never been in a room like this with a man like this, and she needed something solid to hold on to, even if it was just a table. Damian watched her do all of that. He didn't comment on it. He pulled out a chair on his side and sat down, which surprised her. She'd expected him to stand, to use the height of himself the way powerful men often did. Instead, he sat and placed both hands flat on the table and looked at her with the same direct attention he'd had in the ballroom, only now it was quieter, more specific, like a man who had rehearsed the next 10 minutes and was deciding in real time whether to follow the script. "Sit down," he said, then, "Please." The please landed with a kind of awkwardness, like a word he'd added on late, like manners were something he carried but didn't always remember to unpack. She sat, not because he told her to, because her legs were tired and the adrenaline was starting to metabolize into something shaky. "Your name is Damian Moretti," she said. "Yes. I know who you are. I know you do." "Then you understand why sitting in a hotel meeting room with you at 11 at night is not something I would normally do." He looked at her steadily. "Your father contacted me 8 months ago." The air went out of her lungs. She'd expected a lot of things. An explanation of the scene in the ballroom, some kind of negotiation, maybe. A threat dressed up as concern. She had not expected Richard Hayes' name to come out of this man's mouth like it was something he'd been carrying for a while. "Say that again," she said. "Richard Hayes, forensic accountant. He contacted me through a third party in September of last year." Damian's hands were still flat on the table. He'd uncovered something he couldn't take to the police. He needed someone outside the system. "He came to you." The disbelief in her voice was not directed at Damian. It was directed at the specific, infuriating logic of her father, who had spent 40 years believing that the right person for any job was whoever could actually do it, regardless of how that looked to anyone else. "My father, who drove 45 miles to return a wallet he found in a parking lot, who voted in every election for 30 years, that man came to you." "That man was smart enough to know that what he'd found was too big for honest channels," Damian said. "The people who should have handled it were already inside it." She pressed her hands flat on the table, mirroring him without intending to. "What did he find?" "How much do you know about Whitmore Capital Group?" "It's Brandon's family company. Commercial real estate, some private equity. They're everywhere in this city. Foundations, city contracts, hospital boards." She paused. "My father audited 3 of their subsidiary accounts 2 years ago. Routine work. He didn't talk about it. He never talked about clients. He found something during that audit that wasn't routine." Damian's voice stayed even. "Shell companies. Layered through 4 different holding structures. Money moving in from overseas accounts and coming out clean through real estate transactions. He tracked it back 14 months. By the time he contacted me, he'd built a complete picture." A pause. We're talking about laundering at a scale that funded bribery across city council, two federal judges, and the zoning board, among others. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. The refrigeration unit in the credenza hummed. He didn't tell me any of this, she said. He didn't want you inside it. He got himself killed instead. The word landed between them. Damien didn't flinch, which told her he'd known it was coming. Yes, he said. They made it look like a car accident. Her voice was flat. 14 weeks of being told it was a car accident, of being told the road was icy, of being told these things happen, of sitting in a funeral home next to her mother while a man she didn't know described the arrangements for burying her father at 61. The police, the lead investigator on the accident report, is on the Whitmore payroll, has been for 6 years. She stood up. Not because she was leaving, she just couldn't sit still with that information. She walked to the window, which looked out onto a service alley and a brick wall, and put her hand flat against the glass and felt how cold it was, and stood there. You knew, she said. You knew all of this, and you didn't. She turned. Why didn't you do something, before? Damien looked at her. I was doing something. Building a case takes time. Evidence that holds up takes time. Your father understood that. We had a plan. And then he died before you could use it. Yes. And the evidence? A pause. Just long enough to tell her this was the part that mattered. We don't know where it is, he said. Your father held the primary copy. He was supposed to hand it off. He didn't make it. Charlotte turned back to the window. The brick walls stared back. She thought about her father's office, which she hadn't been able to clean out yet. The boxes still stacked in her car because every time she got home she couldn't make herself carry them inside. She thought about the wristwatch on her arm, which he'd taken off in the hospital 3 years ago when they thought he might need surgery, and had never put back on, and had pressed into her hand one afternoon with no explanation, and she'd worn it since without asking why. She thought he knew. She thought he knew something was coming, and he started saying goodbye in the ways he could without saying it out loud. Brandon knows? She asked. Brandon knows enough. Whether he knows how deep it goes? Damien stopped. Tonight wasn't random. The Whitmores are aware that your father had documentation. They don't know where it is, but they know who his daughter is. Brandon showing up here, doing what he did in front of that room. He was marking me, she said, showing everyone I was alone, not protected. Damien looked at her with something that was close to surprise. Yes. I'm a second-grade teacher, not an idiot. I know what you are, he said, and the way he said it was neither dismissive nor flattering, just factual, like a man filing information correctly. She came back to the table, didn't sit, stood at the edge of it, and looked at him. So you announced I was your wife. I made you untouchable, without asking me. There wasn't time to ask you. There's always time to ask someone before you claim ownership of them in a room full of strangers. Her voice had an edge she didn't bother filing down. I understand what you were trying to do. I'm not saying it didn't work. I'm saying you don't get to decide that for me. The room was quiet. His 2 men were by the door, and she'd half forgotten them, and now she was aware of them again. Their careful stillness, their attention, the way they watched without expression. She was aware of exactly how small this room was. Damien said, You're right. She hadn't expected that either. I should have found another way, he said. There wasn't one I could see in the time I had. But you're right that it wasn't my decision to make. He didn't elaborate, didn't apologize more than that single acknowledgement, just said it and held it. She studied him. This was not what she'd expected Damien Moretti to be. The name carried a specific weight in Chicago, the kind that showed up in federal case filings and buried in newspaper articles that stopped short of direct accusation. She'd expected someone colder, more performative. She'd expected someone who moved through the world like Brandon Whitmore did, using space and certainty as instruments. Damien was certain, but it was a different kind, quieter, like a man who knew his own dimensions and didn't need to remind anyone else of them. What happens now? She asked. You come with me, tonight, until we know how much pressure they're going to put on you. Come with you where? A house I own on the North Shore. It's secure. My people are there. Your people, she repeated. Your Moretti people. Yes. I'm going to stay in a house belonging to a Mafia boss. She heard herself say it. Because my ex-boyfriend's family had my father murdered. And the evidence is missing, and you've told 300 people I'm your wife. A pause. This is my life now. Something moved across his face. Not quite humor. A recognition of the absurdity, maybe. The same absurdity she was sitting in, just from a different angle. You don't have to come, he said. I can put a man outside your apartment. It's not as clean, but it's possible. And if I find the evidence? He was still. If the evidence is somewhere in my father's things, she said, and I find it, then what? I hand it to you? You hand it to me and I get it to the right federal investigators, the ones not connected to Whitmore. How do I know you won't just use it yourself, leverage it, trade it? Whitmore's go down, but Moretti goes up. She watched his face. That would be a logical play. He met her eyes. Your father trusted me with his life and it cost him. I'm aware of that. I'm not asking you to trust me the same way. I'm asking you to let me finish what he started. It wasn't a perfect answer. It had the shape of truth, but she couldn't verify it, couldn't triangulate it against anything solid. And she was standing in a hotel meeting room at 11:15 at night with her father 4 months in the ground, and her legs were tired, and she missed him with a physical force she carried everywhere now, like a second skeleton inside her own. She picked up her clutch from the table. I need to call my mother. Of course. And I need my own room, with a lock. Yes. And if I decide to leave at any point, I leave. Nobody stops me. Damien looked at her steadily. Nobody stops you. She walked toward the door. The taller man, the one with the jaw scar, stepped slightly to the side without being asked. She stopped with her hand near the handle and didn't turn around. His name, she said. The man who drove the car into my father's. Do you know it? A pause. Long enough that she knew the answer. Yes, Damien said. Okay, she said. She opened the door and walked out. The North Shore house was not what she'd imagined, and she'd had the 40-minute drive to imagine things. She'd pictured something ostentatious, something that announced itself. What she got was a cedar and stone structure set back from the road behind a tree line, unremarkable from the outside in the specific way that very secure things sometimes were. It had the quality of a place that didn't want to be looked at, and wasn't. Inside was different. Warm light, clean lines, books on shelves that had the disordered look of books actually read. A kitchen that smelled like someone had cooked in it recently, something with garlic and herbs. She walked through it behind a woman named Elena, mid-40s, compact, carrying herself with the practical authority of someone who ran things, who showed her to a room on the second floor with a window overlooking a dark garden and a bathroom with towels that were folded, but not the hotel kind of folded, the kind of folded that meant someone had done it quickly and practically. There was a lock on the door, a real one, not a privacy latch. Charlotte locked it. She sat on the edge of the bed and called her mother. She kept her voice steady. She said she was fine. She said she'd explain more tomorrow. She listened to her mother's silence, which was the kind that held more questions than words, and said, I'm following something Dad started. I'll explain when I can. Her mother said, he always worried about you more than you knew. Charlotte sat with that after she hung up. The watch was still on her wrist. She turned it over. The face, the worn leather strap, the small scratch along the case that had been there since she could remember. Her father's hands had worn this watch for 20 years. He'd given it to her without explanation. She thought about that now differently than she had before. She took out her phone and opened the Photos app. 2 months ago, going through some boxes from his office, she'd photographed pages of notes she hadn't understood at the time. His handwriting, his accounting shorthand, numbers and abbreviations she'd looked at once and told herself she'd go back to. She'd never gone back. She opened the photos now, 14 images, pages of her father's yellow legal pad, his cramped left-handed writing, numbers that tracked across columns, abbreviations she knew were meaningful because he'd never written anything that wasn't. She enlarged the third image. In the bottom corner of the page, her father had written a string of characters she'd dismissed as a file reference. She'd assumed it was an account number, client code, something routine. She looked at it now. It wasn't a file reference. It was a location. She stared at it for a long time. The refrigeration unit in the house hummed the same frequency as the one in the hotel meeting room, some constant in all the buildings she moved through tonight, while her life rearranged itself around her. She crossed to the door and unlocked it and opened it. Damien was in the hallway, not pacing, just standing near the wall with his jacket off and his arms loose at his sides, and she had the sense he'd been there for a while, not guarding the door but not moving away from it either. He looked at her. She turned her phone around so he could see the screen. "I know where it is," she said. He looked at the image. Something moved through his expression, fast, controlled, but there. She'd learn later to read his face better, to catch those quick contractions. This one was relief, just a flash of it. "Where?" he said. "My father's office downtown. He kept a lockbox behind a panel in the credenza. I thought it was for insurance documents." She paused. "The combination is my birthday." Something shifted between them in the hallway. Not warmth. It was too early for warmth. There was too much still unsaid and unproven between them. But something. The specific change in air pressure when two people realize they need each other to survive the same thing. "We go in the morning," he said. "We go now," she said. "If Brandon reported back tonight, they'll have people watching that office by morning." He looked at her for a long moment. That measuring look she was starting to recognize, the one that wasn't calculating so much as recalibrating, adjusting for the person in front of him being somewhat different than anticipated. "Now," he said. "Now." He reached for his jacket. She watched him transform back into something more formal, more armored. The man with his jacket off had been slightly more human. She filed that away without knowing why. They were in the car. Black, unmarked, the kind of car that didn't get remembered, when his phone went off. He answered on the second ring, said nothing for 4 seconds, then said, "When?" His voice hadn't changed, not in volume, not in pace, but the quality of it shifted in a way she felt in her chest. He ended the call. He looked straight ahead at the road. "Victor called the Whitmores," he said. She waited. The car moved through Chicago streets that were quiet at this hour, lit in amber and shadow. "Victor Kane, my security chief. He's been feeding them information." His hands on his knees were absolutely still, which she already understood meant the opposite of calm. "They know we're moving tonight." She let that sit for a second. "How long has he been?" "Long enough." "So they know about the office." "They know something is happening. They may not know the specifics." He turned to look at her. "We can still get there first, but it will not be clean." She thought about the office. She'd been inside it twice since her father died. Once the day after, with the police, when everything was still impossible, and once to collect personal items with her mother, both of them moving through the space with a kind of numb deficiency because that was the only way to do it. She knew where the credenza was. She knew the panel. She'd watched her father open it once, years ago, when she was visiting for lunch, and he'd needed something from it, and hadn't thought to hide the gesture from her. She'd been 17. She hadn't known it mattered. "Define not clean," she said. "Armed men, possibly. Certainly someone already watching the entrance." He paused. "You can wait in the car." "The combination is my birthday," she said. "I'm not waiting in the car." He looked at her again. She was getting used to that look, the slight adjustment, the recalibration. "All right," he said. They were 4 blocks from her father's office when Damien's second phone, the one that had been silent all night, buzzed once. He looked at the screen. His jaw set. He said, "They moved up the timeline. There are 2 men already in the building." The driver, silent until now, hands at 10 and 2, eyes on the road, said, "How do you want to handle it?" Charlotte was looking out the window at the street, at a city she'd lived in her whole life that had been secretly hosting a different city underneath it, one her father had found and tried to expose and been killed for finding. She thought about the flash drive or whatever it was in that lockbox with her birthday combination. She thought about Victor Kane calling the Whitmores. She thought about betrayal, how it never comes from strangers, only from people close enough to matter. She thought about her father's face the last time she'd seen him. Thanksgiving. He'd been distracted, she'd thought. She'd attributed it to work. He'd hugged her at the door longer than usual, both arms, the kind of hug that had a weight to it, and she'd been slightly embarrassed by it because they weren't a family that held on too long. They were a family that patted backs and let go. She hadn't known it was the last time. She hadn't held on. "Stop the car," Charlotte said. The driver looked at Damien. "Stop the car," Damien said. They stopped. She turned to look at him. The city moved around them, a cab, a delivery truck, 2 people walking a dog, all of it indifferent, all of it normal. Those men in the building, she said, are they going to destroy the evidence or take it? Take it, Damien said. If they destroy it, it's obvious. They take it, it disappears quietly, and they claim it never existed. So if we go in and there are 2 armed men, your goal is to take what's in the lockbox before they find it. Yes. There's another entrance, she said. The building has a loading dock on the south side. My father took me through it once when the front was blocked by a construction crew. There's a freight elevator that goes to his floor. Damien was very still. If your men go through the front and make noise, she said, whoever's inside will move to secure the office. Everything they do to secure the office takes them away from the credenza. She paused. While they're reacting to the front, we go through the loading dock. The car was quiet. Damien said, You've done this before. I teach 7-year-olds, she said. I run 8 simultaneous distractions every day before lunch. I know how misdirection works. Something in his face shifted. Not a smile. Something earlier than a smile, the thing that precedes it. A recognition, an involuntary opening. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. The driver turned the car south. Charlotte's hands were in her lap, and they were not shaking. She was 33 years old, and 4 months ago her father had been driven off a road in the dark, and now she was in the back of an unmarked black car with a man Chicago feared, heading toward the building where her father had spent the best years of his working life. And somewhere inside it was the thing he'd died to protect, and 2 armed men were already waiting. She pressed her thumb to the face of her father's watch. The second hand moved, steady, indifferent, forward. The loading dock was dark when they pulled around the corner, and dark was the one thing they had going for them, and it would have to be enough. The loading dock smelled like diesel and wet cardboard, and the specific cold that collects in places that don't get enough sun. Charlotte moved through it without a flashlight because Damien had said no lights, and she'd agreed without asking why because she already understood why. The loading dock had a window facing the alley, and light would travel and light would be seen. So she navigated by memory and the thin ambient glow from a street lamp 40 feet away, her hand trailing the wall, counting doors. 3rd door, freight elevator. She found it. Damien was 2 steps behind her, close enough that she could hear him breathing, steady, measured, the breathing of someone who had been in tight spaces before and knew that panic was a choice. His man, a compact, quiet figure named Roca, who'd materialized from the front seat when the car stopped, was behind him. She pressed the elevator call button. The machinery groaned to life somewhere above them, slow and reluctant, the sound of something old being asked to move quickly. How long? Damien said, barely audible. 30 seconds, she said. They waited. Somewhere at the front of the building, distant, muffled by walls and floors, she heard something. Couldn't identify it. Voices, maybe. A door. The elevator arrived with a hydraulic sigh. The door was heavy. She pulled it. Damien held it. They got in. The inside of the freight elevator smelled like machine oil and dust. A single bulb. She hit the button for the 7th floor and watched the door close, and then the building was moving past them in increments. When we come out, she said quietly, his office is left. End of the hall. Corner suite. Describe the layout inside. Front area, a desk for his assistant. Door to the main office. The credenza is against the east wall, under the window. It's dark wood. There's a panel on the left side. It looks like a decorative inset, but it presses in. The lockbox is behind it. She paused. It's small, metal, gray. Damien nodded once. If someone is already in the office, she said, let me handle that. I need to be specific. If someone is already at the credenza, Charlotte. His voice was very quiet. Let me handle that. The elevator stopped. 7th floor. She pulled the door. The hallway was dark. Emergency lighting only, those low red-tinged strips near the floor that made everything look like the inside of something living. The carpet absorbed their footsteps. The hall was empty in both directions. She turned left. They moved fast and low, Roca behind them now watching the rear. 20 feet, 30. The corner office door had a glass panel beside it. Her father's name still on the placard, Richard Hayes, Forensic Accounting, in the clean sans serif type the building used for everyone. She'd walked past this placard 100 times and not looked at it the way she looked at it now, in the dark. While somewhere in the building, two men who worked for the people who killed him were looking for what he'd left behind. The door was already open, not wide, 3 inches. Enough to know someone had been here. Damien put his hand flat on her sternum. Not hard, just a stop signal. And she stopped. He moved to the door, put 2 fingers in the gap, pushed it slowly. The assistant's area was empty, dark. Her father's coffee mug was still on the corner of the assistant's desk. She'd noticed it the day she came to collect his things and hadn't been able to make herself take it. It was still there. Damien moved through the doorway. She followed. The main office door was ajar. Inside, the sound of someone moving carefully. A drawer opening. The soft thud of files being set aside. Damien held up 2 fingers. 2 people. Charlotte's heart was going fast now, not the panicked fast of someone who didn't know what to do, but the focused fast of someone whose body had decided this was real and was adjusting accordingly. She could feel her own pulse in her hands. Damien looked at her. His eyes asked the question, where? She pointed to the east wall. To the left of the main office door, through the door, 4 feet. She mimed the shape of the credenza with her hands in the dark. He nodded. He went through the door first. What happened next took approximately 11 seconds, and Charlotte counted them without meaning to because time had become very specific, and she was paying attention to all of it. There were 2 men, one at her father's desk, rifling through the lower drawer. One near the bookshelf, flashlight in hand. Roca handled the one at the bookshelf before the flashlight hit the floor. Controlled, fast, the particular efficiency of someone who does this without enjoyment or drama. Damien reached the man at the desk before the man at the desk had fully registered what was happening. A brief struggle, contained, sharp, then stillness. 11 seconds. The office was quiet again. Charlotte walked to the credenza. Her hands found the left panel in the dark. Smooth wood, a nearly invisible seam. She pressed. It gave. She reached inside. Her fingers found the lockbox immediately. Cold metal, solid. She pulled it out. 3-digit combination. Her birthday, month, day. She turned the dials. She opened it. Inside, a flash drive, a folded piece of paper, a photograph she couldn't make out in the dark. She took all 3. Pressed the drive into her palm, the paper into her jacket pocket, the photograph she held. Got it, she said. Damien was beside her in seconds. They were back in the elevator before either of the men on the floor could do anything useful, and in the car before the 60-second mark, and moving north through empty Chicago streets before Charlotte let herself breathe at the volume she'd been needing to breathe at for the past 4 minutes. She pressed the flash drive against her sternum with one hand, the watch on her other wrist. Both things her father had left her, one on purpose, one because he'd run out of time to explain. We have it, she said. It came out strange. Flatter than she intended. Damien looked at her. You okay? No, she said honestly, but I'm fine. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he took out his phone and called someone and said, in a voice she was starting to associate with things being managed, We have the asset. Coming to you now. Have Marcus ready. And then he was quiet, and she looked out the window at the city, and they drove. The safe house was different from the North Shore property. Smaller, urban, a 3-flat in a neighborhood she vaguely recognized but couldn't name. The kind of block that had been something else 20 years ago and was still in the middle of becoming something new. Inside. Bright kitchen, circular table, a man she hadn't met yet sitting with a laptop open and 2 phones lined up beside it, with the precision of someone who worked in information and treated it like a physical thing that needed organizing. Marcus. Late 40s, thinning hair, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at the flash drive she placed on the table like it was something delicate. Give me 20 minutes, he said. He got it done in 14. Charlotte stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee she didn't remember pouring and watched the neighborhood. A dog walker, a light on in an upstairs apartment, a taxi idling at the corner. While Marcus worked and Damien paced in the next room making short calls she couldn't quite hear. Okay, Marcus said. Come look at this. She came to the table. The flash drive contained 4 folders. Marcus opened the first. Financial records, hundreds of pages, columns of numbers and account codes that looked like nothing until you understood what you were looking at, and then they looked like everything. She could read them, not at Marcus's speed, but she'd grown up watching her father bring work home, watching him at the kitchen table with his yellow legal pads and his careful handwriting, and she knew the shape of this kind of documentation even before she understood its content. The second folder, emails. Internal Whitmore Group correspondence going back 3 years. She scanned subject lines. Her stomach moved. The third folder, a list of names. 47 names. Politicians, judges, investigators. A city council member she'd voted for twice. The fourth folder was locked. Password protected, Marcus said. Give me a little more time on that. Charlotte pulled the folded paper from her pocket. Opened it. Her father's handwriting. Not the cramped accounting shorthand she'd photographed on his legal pads. This was his personal script, the slightly larger, looser writing he used for non-work things. Letters to her mother, birthday cards. She knew it the way she knew his voice. It said, Charlotte. If someone else is reading this, it means I wasn't able to get there first. The fourth folder is what matters most. The password is the name of the dog we never got to have. She made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a cry. Something in between that she covered quickly with her hand. The dog they never got to have. When she was 9, she'd campaigned for a golden retriever for 8 consecutive months. She'd named it already, before they ever got it, certain she could will the dog into existence through the naming. Her father had said, "We're not getting a dog." She'd said, "We're getting a dog, and his name is Arthur." They never got the dog. Arthur became a recurring family joke, referenced at Thanksgiving, at birthdays, in the occasional card. Her father had sent her a card 3 years ago with a golden retriever on the front and written inside, "Still thinking about Arthur." She straightened. "The password is Arthur," she said. Marcus typed it. The folder opened. Inside was one file. A video. Marcus looked at her. She nodded. He opened it. The video was 42 minutes long, shot on what looked like a phone propped against something solid, a little unsteady, the angle slightly low. The location, a private dining room, dark paneling, a table set with 4 chairs, only 3 of them occupied. The date stamp in the corner, 14 months ago. 3 men at the table. Edward Whitmore. Charlotte recognized him from newspaper photographs. 70s, silver-haired, the particular well-maintained look of men who have never had a problem money couldn't manage. He sat at the head of the table with the ease of a man in his own territory. Beside him, a man she didn't recognize. 50s, heavy through the shoulders, a signet ring on his right hand. Across from them, a man whose face she knew from the news. A federal investigator. A man who'd been profiled 6 months ago in a magazine piece about Chicago's efforts to combat financial crime. A man whose face she had seen on a poster outside a government building. A man who was supposed to be the person you went to when the system failed you. Edward Whitmore, on video, in his own voice, said, "Richard Hayes needs to stop. I don't care how it's handled. I need it quiet, and I need it done before the quarter close." The federal investigator on video nodded and said, "I'll take care of it." Charlotte stood very still. Marcus had gone completely quiet. The kitchen was so silent she could hear the dog walker's footsteps outside, 3 floors down. She watched the remaining 39 minutes. She watched Edward Whitmore describe her father by name, describe what he'd found, describe the specific risk he represented. She watched the federal investigator, whose name she now understood, she had seen on official correspondence after her father's death, correspondence she'd been too devastated to read carefully, confirm that he could manage the investigation. She watched a third man outline the mechanics, the logistics, the method, her father's car, the road, the timing, all of it. Planned, documented, by her father, who had somehow gotten a camera into that room and sat in the cold somewhere and watched and recorded and built his case and then been killed before he could use it. When it ended, the kitchen was still quiet. Charlotte set down the coffee mug very carefully. She pressed both palms flat on the table. She breathed. Damien came to the doorway. She hadn't heard him come back into the room. He looked at her face and then at Marcus, and Marcus turned the laptop so Damien could see the paused video. Edward Whitmore, frozen mid-sentence, silver-haired and comfortable, and utterly certain he was untouchable. Damien's face did something she'd learned to recognize later as the face he made when something he already suspected was confirmed. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. "The federal investigator on this video," she said. Her voice came out controlled. She was making a specific choice about her voice right now. He's the one who was supposed to receive the evidence. Yes, Damien said. You knew. A pause. I suspected. I didn't have proof until now. You were going to send my father's evidence to the man who ordered my father's death. No. His voice was flat. I have a contact at the FBI field office. Not Chicago Division, Washington. Someone clean. Someone I've verified independently over 6 years. He paused. That was always the plan. Chicago channels were never the play. She looked at him. You should have told me that. Yes, he said. I should have. She looked back at the laptop, at Edward Whitmore's frozen face, at the man who'd sat across the table from him and agreed that her father needed to be dealt with, and then had written correspondence she'd received and not read carefully enough because she'd been too destroyed by grief to read anything carefully. She thought, I missed it. It was in the paperwork. It was right there. She thought, Dad, you put it all together. You saw all of it. You just needed a little more time. She pressed her thumb to her father's watch. What happens now? She said. Damien opened his mouth. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted. That rapid recalibration she'd seen twice before. The face of someone who has just received information that requires restructuring everything currently in progress. He answered, said nothing, listened for 23 seconds. Then, don't let him leave. And he hung up. The silence in the kitchen was different now. Heavier. Victor Kane is at the North Shore house, he said. Charlotte waited. He came in through the back. He says he needs to talk. He says... Damien stopped. His jaw set. He says there's something he didn't tell me, something about your father's death that he's been holding for 4 months. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked. 4 seconds. 5. He knew something about how my father died, she said carefully, and he kept it. That's what he says. And you believe him. Damien's hands were loose at his sides again, which she now understood meant the opposite of loose. I believe he's scared enough to tell the truth. Fear does what nothing else can, sometimes. She picked up the flash drive from the table and held it. We go. Charlotte, he sat on information about my father's murder for 4 months while working for you. The words came out level, quiet, with an edge underneath that surprised even her. I'm going. He didn't argue. She was starting to understand that he didn't argue when she was right. They drove back to the North Shore in a different car, a different route. Marcus stayed with the laptop and a copy of the files already uploading to a secure server she didn't know the name of. Roca drove. The city thinned as they moved north, the density of buildings giving way to wider streets, bigger trees, the particular darkness of neighborhoods that didn't need to announce themselves. Victor Kane was in the living room when they walked in. He was sitting in a chair that he hadn't chosen for comfort, straight-backed, hands on his knees, the posture of a man who had spent the drive here practicing what he was going to say and had arrived to find that none of the words were adequate. He was somewhere in his 50s, big through the chest, thick hands, gray at his temples. She'd expected someone who looked guilty. He looked tired, which was somehow worse. 2 of Damien's men were against the wall behind him, not touching him, just there. Damien stood in the center of the room. He didn't sit. Charlotte stood beside him, which she did not plan and did not examine. Victor looked at Damien for a long moment. Then he looked at Charlotte and looked away, which told her more than the looking would have. Talk, Damien said. Victor's hands tightened on his knees. He breathed. The night Richard Hayes died, I knew the timeline. The Whitmores contacted me 3 days before. They didn't tell me who. They said they were moving on a problem, and they needed our people off a specific route that night, off the north side corridor between 9 and 11. Charlotte's body went very still. I told them we had no activity on that route, Victor continued, which was true. And I told myself that was all I was doing, confirming an absence, that I didn't know what the problem was. But you did know, Damien said. Victor's jaw tightened. I knew Richard Hayes was connected to you. I knew he'd found something. I didn't know they were going to... He stopped, started again. I suspected. I told myself I was wrong. The room was completely still. Charlotte said, You suspected they were going to kill my father, and you cleared the route. Victor looked at her then. He didn't look away this time. To his credit, if there was any credit left in the man, he didn't look away. Yes. She thought about several things in rapid succession. Her father's hug at Thanksgiving, both arms, the weight of it. Her mother's voice on the phone saying he always worried about you more than you knew. The coffee mug still on the assistant's desk in the dark office. The dog named Arthur, who never existed. Edward Whitmore frozen on a screen saying, "I don't care how it's handled." She thought about all of it in approximately 2 seconds. Then she said, with a quiet she felt in her own chest like something pulled tight, "What were they holding over you?" Victor blinked. He hadn't expected that question. "What did they have on you?" she said. "Because men like you don't do something like this for money. So what did they have?" A long beat. Damien had gone very still beside her. Victor said, "My daughter, she was in trouble, legal trouble 2 years ago, the kind that doesn't go away quietly. They said they could make it go away. They said all I had to do was keep them informed, occasionally clear a path." He stopped. "I told myself it would stay small." "It didn't stay small," Charlotte said. "No," he said. "It didn't." The silence stretched. Damien hadn't moved. She could feel the specific quality of his stillness, not the controlled stillness she'd come to read as neutral, but something tighter, something that was working very hard to remain contained. She said, before Damien could speak, "Is there anything you know that we don't? Anything operational, right now, tonight?" Victor looked at her. Something in his face shifted, a recognition of the fact that she was the one running this question, and that was unexpected, and perhaps, in some calculus she couldn't fully read, a relief. "Edward Whitmore scheduled a meeting," Victor said, "for 48 hours from now. He's inviting Damien. He's calling it a negotiation." A pause. "It's not a negotiation." Damien said, When did he tell you this?" 2 hours ago, before I came here." Victor's hands were very tight on his knees now. "He thinks I'm still his. He thinks He wanted me to confirm you'd accept the meeting." "And you came here instead," Charlotte said. "I came here instead." The room held all of it for a moment. The betrayal, the partial redemption of the betrayal's confession, the specific math of a man who had done an unforgivable thing and was trying to find a way to live in the same body as the knowledge of it. Damien turned away from Victor. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, looking out at the dark garden. Charlotte watched him. She watched the set of his shoulders, the controlled quality of his breathing, the specific way he was standing that she understood now meant he was furious, and choosing not to be furious here and now because furious here and now didn't serve anything. She waited. He turned back. He looked at Victor with a flatness that she understood was more dangerous than anger. "You're going to call him back," Damien said. "You're going to tell him I'll take the meeting." Victor went pale. "Damien, and then you're going to tell me every single thing you know, every name, every payment, every conversation, everything." He paused. "And then we'll talk about what happens to you." Victor nodded, once. The nod of a man who understood he had exhausted all other options. Damien looked at Charlotte. She held the flash drive in her hand and thought about the 42-minute video of Edward Whitmore ordering her father's death, and the locked fourth folder that had been opened with the name of a dog who never existed, and a meeting in 48 hours that was not a negotiation. She thought, "We're sending him in there." She thought, "And I'm not waiting in the car." "The evidence copies," she said. "How many do we have?" "Marcus is uploading now. 3 separate servers plus a physical backup." Damien's voice was steady. "By morning, we have distribution capability to every major federal outlet. If something goes wrong at the meeting, the evidence goes anyway." He held her gaze. "That was always the plan. The evidence gets out regardless of what happens to us. It goes to my Washington contact. It goes to 2 journalists. It goes to a federal prosecutor in New York who has been working a parallel case on Whitmore's East Coast operations for 18 months. He paused. "Your father's work doesn't disappear, no matter what." She looked at him for a long moment in the quiet of the North Shore living room with Victor Kane sitting in his chair and 2 of Damien's men against the wall and the dark garden outside and the whole weight of the past 4 months. The grief, the numbness, the boxes she still hadn't unpacked, the hug she hadn't held long enough. "Okay," she said. She turned and walked to the stairs. She needed 4 hours of sleep, and she was going to get them. She was going to need to be sharp in 48 hours in a room with a man who had ordered her father's death. And she was going to be sharp because she had spent 14 years making sure 23 7-year-olds a year learned how to read. And she had never yet walked into a room she wasn't prepared for. She stopped at the foot of the stairs. "Damien," she said without turning. "Yeah." "The man who drove the car. The one who actually—" She stopped. "Where is he?" A pause. "He's in the building," Damien said. "The Whitmore building. He works there. Security." She absorbed that. A man who had killed her father was currently employed by the man who'd ordered it, going in every morning, riding the elevator, eating lunch somewhere, living his life in the building Richard Hayes had spent years exposing. "Okay," she said again, and went upstairs. She didn't sleep for the first hour. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel the full weight of what she now knew. The video. Victor's confession. The meeting that was not a meeting. The specific face of Edward Whitmore frozen on a laptop screen. She let herself feel all of it because she'd learned, in the months since her father died, that feelings not felt did not disappear. They compacted. They became something structural, something you built your next wrong decision on top of. She felt it. She named it. She set it aside. Then she closed her eyes. And somewhere in the house below her, Damien Moretti sat alone at the kitchen table with a phone in his hand and the knowledge that his most trusted man had cleared the road on which Richard Hayes had been killed, and he held that knowledge in the same place he held everything else that couldn't be undone, which was somewhere behind his sternum, very still, very heavy, and it did not leave when morning came. The morning came in gray and flat, the kind of Chicago morning that didn't bother with transition, just arrived fully formed with its cloud cover and its cold and its indifference to whatever you'd survived the night before. She had her father's folded note in front of her, smoothed flat, and a mug of coffee she'd made herself because she'd found the coffee and figured out the machine rather than wait for someone to offer. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours, but she'd slept them hard and clean, and she felt the difference. Damien looked at her, then at the coffee. Then he found a mug and poured his own. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table and neither of them spoke for a full minute, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. She was starting to understand that silence with Damien was not absence. It was just another form of attention. "Victor talked until 2 in the morning, he said finally. "How much?" "Enough." He wrapped both hands around the mug. 18 months of contact with Whitmore's people. 12 specific instances where he passed information. 3 occasions where he cleared operational space. A pause. "The night your father died was the 3rd. Charlotte looked at the table. "What are you going to do with him?" "He's going to testify. Everything he knows, on record, to my Washington contact and the New York prosecutor." Damien's voice was flat. Not angry, past angry, into something more resolved. "After that, he leaves Chicago, permanently." "That's it?" He looked at her. "What would you have me do?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness she'd come to expect from him. The willingness to put a thing in front of her without dressing it. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "Something in me wants worse for him. But the part that thinks clearly—" She stopped. "He's more valuable confessing than suffering." "Yes." "My father would have said the same thing." Damien nodded once. "Your father was a precise man." They drank coffee. Outside, the gray morning continued doing what it was doing. "The meeting," she said. 48 hours. Today is one of them. We prepare today. We go tomorrow night." "Tell me what prepare means." He looked at her steadily. "Marcus has confirmed distribution with the New York prosecutor. The evidence package is in 3 separate hands already. The upload completed at 4 this morning." He paused. "Whatever happens at that meeting, the evidence is already beyond the Whitmore's reach. They can't stop it." "They don't know that." "No. They think this is still a negotiation. They think they can buy it back." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite contempt. "Edward Whitmore has been buying his way out of consequences for 50 years. It's the only play he knows. So we walk in and let him make the offer. You don't have to walk in." She picked up the coffee mug, set it down. "We've covered this. We've covered you wanting to come. We haven't covered what it means if it goes sideways." Define sideways. His jaw tightened slightly. Edward Whitmore has spent 50 years accumulating people who owe him things. Some of those people carry weapons and have no legal exposure because they don't officially exist. He held her gaze. If he decides the meeting is a trap, then we're both in the same room with the same problem, she said. And I'd rather be in the room than outside it wondering. He looked at her for a long moment. She'd noticed he did this, gave her the full weight of his attention when he was deciding something. Not performing consideration, actually doing it. You stay beside me, he said. You don't move without me. If I tell you to get down, you get down. Agreed. And you don't speak unless I indicate. She raised an eyebrow. In the meeting, he said, until the moment is right. She understood. There was a moment coming in that room. She could feel the shape of it even without knowing its specifics. A moment where Edward Whitmore would need to see something he hadn't planned for. She was that thing. She was Richard Hayes's daughter, with her father's watch on her wrist and the full knowledge of what that video contained. And she was something Edward Whitmore had categorized as a loose end, not a combatant. The miscalculation was already built in. Okay, she said. The day moved slowly the way days do when you're waiting for something inevitable. Marcus ran through the evidence package with her twice, making sure she understood every component. The financial records, the emails, the name list, the video. She asked questions, and he answered them with the patient precision of someone who respected her enough to be exact. By afternoon, she understood the full architecture of what her father had built. 2 years of quiet, meticulous documentation, assembled in the margins of legitimate work, hidden in the language of accounting, invisible to everyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Her father had been extraordinary at his job. She'd always known it abstractly. Watching his work made it real in a way that sat in her chest with a weight she couldn't name. She called her mother at 3 in the afternoon, kept it short, said she was safe, she was close to something, she'd explain soon. Her mother said, "Your cousin Diane called. She's upset about what happened at the party." A pause. "I told her you were handling something more important." Charlotte smiled. Her mother knew more than she let on. She always had. At 5, Damien found her in the upstairs room where she'd been sitting with the folded note and the photograph from the lockbox, which she'd finally examined in daylight. It was a photograph of her father with a man she didn't recognize, standing outside a building, shaking hands. Her father was smiling. She didn't know when it was taken or who the other man was. She showed it to Damien. He looked at it. Something shifted in his face. "That's my father," he said. She looked up. 8 years ago, before he died. He took the photograph carefully, held it. "I didn't know they'd met." She watched him look at the photograph. It was the least controlled she'd seen him. Not emotional exactly, but open in a way that was clearly unguarded, clearly a thing he hadn't prepared for. His father in the photograph was shorter than she'd have expected, broader, with a kind of warmth in his face that didn't match whatever story the name Moretti was supposed to tell. "Your father and mine," she said quietly, "knew each other." He looked up from the photograph. "Or met once. Found each other somehow." He set it down carefully on the table. "The world is very small in ways you don't know until you're inside it." She left him with the photograph and went to find something to eat. They left for Whitmore Manor at 7 the following evening. The motorcade was smaller than she'd expected. 2 cars, not 5. Damien explained briefly that arriving with force announced was not the same as arriving with force available. What she could see was 2 cars. What Edward Whitmore's security would see was 2 cars. What was actually positioned within a 4-block radius of the manor was something else entirely, assembled in the preceding 18 hours without visible movement. She sat beside Damien in the back. Roca drove. The second car, behind them, held 3 people she'd seen around the safe house but hadn't learned the names of. Charlotte had changed. Not into anything formal, because she wasn't performing formality for Edward Whitmore. She wore dark clothes, clean and fitted, with her father's watch on her wrist and the flash drive in her inside jacket pocket, even though it was a copy, even though the originals were already distributed, because she wanted to walk in there with her father's work in her chest. She wanted to feel it when she looked at Edward Whitmore. "How does he expect this to go?" she asked, as the car moved through the northern suburbs, through neighborhoods of old money and long driveways and gates that opened with codes. Damien looked straight ahead. "He expects to offer me enough money to disappear the evidence. He expects to make the case that what's done is done, and the future matters more than the past. He's made this argument before to other people, and it's worked. Why would it work? Because he gives people a way to tell themselves they made a practical decision instead of a coward's one. He paused. He's good at that. He's been doing it his whole career. And us walking in and refusing changes what, exactly? It doesn't. The evidence is already out. We're not going to negotiate. We're going in to document his attempt to bribe us. On recording. He tapped his lapel, briefly, and to give him the chance to incriminate himself further before the federal people close in. Which happens when? The New York prosecutor filed for warrants 2 hours ago, based on Victor's testimony and the preliminary evidence package. He glanced at her. Tonight is the last night Edward Whitmore sleeps in that house. Charlotte absorbed that. She looked at the dark road ahead. The trees on either side were thick and old, bare in the November cold, their branches making a canopy that the headlights partially illuminated and mostly didn't. When we're in the room with him, she said. Yes. I need you to let me talk at a certain point. He looked at her. Not the whole time. I know that's not the play. She held his gaze. But there will be a moment. You'll know it when it's there, and I need you to step back. He studied her for 3 seconds. What are you going to say? I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I'll know it when I'm in the room with him. Another study. Then, okay. Whitmore Manor announced itself first through its gate, iron, elaborate, the kind of gate that existed to remind visitors of the distance between their life and the life inside. A guard checked the car without warmth or efficiency, with the studied blankness of someone who knew exactly who was arriving and had been told to process it without effect. The gate opened. The driveway was long. The house at the end of it was large in the way of houses that had been expanded by several generations, each adding something that reflected their particular idea of what wealth should look like, the result being imposing without being coherent. Every window was lit. They were met at the door by a man in a suit who didn't introduce himself and led them through a foyer and a hall and into a room at the back of the house. A library, or what was being used as one, with bookshelves on 3 walls and a fireplace, and a table set with glasses and a decanter that no one was going to drink from. Edward Whitmore was already there. Charlotte had watched 42 minutes of him on video. She thought she was prepared. She wasn't, quite. In person, he had a quality that the video hadn't captured. A gravitational thing, a long-accumulated certainty that the room organized itself around him. I was 72, silver-haired, still straight through the back, dressed in the way of men who have always been dressed by someone else's impeccable taste. He had blue eyes that were still sharp, and still the eyes of a man who had looked at other people's lives the way actuaries look at risk tables, categorically, without sentiment. He looked at Damien first, then at Charlotte. She held the look. Something moved through his face, quick, almost imperceptible. He hadn't expected her here. The recalculation was brief and invisible unless you were watching for exactly that. And she was. Mr. Moretti. Whitmore gestured to the chairs opposite him. Thank you for coming. Mr. Whitmore. Damien sat. Charlotte sat beside him. Whitmore poured 2 glasses and pushed them across the table. Neither of them touched the glasses. He registered this without expression. Miss Hayes, he said, looking at her, I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a thorough man. Charlotte said nothing. I want to begin, Whitmore said, settling back, by acknowledging that this situation has become unnecessarily complex. I take some responsibility for that. He said it the way men like him always said things like that, in the specific tone that meant I am performing acknowledgement while meaning none of it. Richard's discovery could have been handled differently. There were options that weren't pursued. Your option, Damien said, was to have him killed. Whitmore's expression didn't change. That was not my decision. You said, on video, and I'm paraphrasing precisely, I don't care how it's handled. I need it quiet, and I need it done. Damien's voice was completely even. That's a decision. The room was very still. Whitmore looked at Damien with the expression of a man who has just recalibrated the weight of what he's dealing with. You have the video. Yes. How much of the documentation? All of it. A pause. Whitmore lifted his glass, drank, set it down. The performance of composure executed flawlessly. Then let's discuss what all of it is worth to the right people. And there it was. The pivot. The offer arriving, wrapped in reasonableness, disguised as practicality. Damien said, "I'm listening." Charlotte focused on staying still. She felt her own heartbeat in her hands. She felt the flash drive in her jacket pocket pressing against her ribs. She watched Edward Whitmore begin to speak about numbers. Significant numbers. Figures that climbed in increments designed to find the ceiling, to locate whatever price Damien Moretti had. And she watched his face while he spoke. The absolute conviction that this was a language everyone spoke eventually, that everyone had a number, that this was simply the adult management of an inconvenient situation. He had ordered the death of a man who couldn't be bought. He genuinely did not understand that some people couldn't be bought. Damien waited until the number stopped climbing. Then he said, "No." Whitmore's composure held. "Perhaps I've—" "No to the number. No to the principle." Damien leaned forward slightly. "The evidence is already in federal hands. It's been there since 4 this morning. Your accounts are frozen as of 6 this evening. The warrants are signed." He paused. "This meeting is being recorded. You've just attempted to bribe a witness to a federal investigation, twice, with escalating amounts." The fireplace crackled. The light in the room was warm and entirely wrong for what was happening in it. Whitmore was still for a long moment. Then something shifted in him. The composure cracked slightly along an edge she hadn't seen before, something colder and older than composure underneath. "You understand what you're doing," he said. His voice was different now, quieter, the social warmth gone. "You understand what you're disrupting." "I do," Damien said. "The people connected to this organization, the people whose names are in whatever documentation you think you have, these are not people who accept disruption quietly." He held Damien's gaze. "You've built something, Moretti. I'm offering you the chance to keep it." "My organization will survive without your protection," Damien said. "Yours won't survive the next 48 hours. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. The fire moved. Somewhere in the house, distant, Charlotte heard movement, footsteps, more than one person, coming from a direction she couldn't identify. She felt it before she understood it. The change in the room's pressure, the specific quality of the air when something shifts from conversation to something else. Whitmore's eyes moved, just briefly, just the smallest cut to the right. A tell. The tell of a man who has just decided something and is checking whether the thing he's decided is in position. She said, "Damien." He was already moving. The door behind them opened. 2 men came through. Not the suited staffers from before, different men, with the particular build and carriage of people kept for specific purposes. Whitmore's security, or something more specific than security. Damien was on his feet before the door fully opened. Charlotte stood. Her chair went back. The next 30 seconds were loud and close and not clean. Not the efficient 11-second operation at her father's office building, but something harder. With more variables, more furniture, the confined space of the library working against everyone equally. She pressed her back against the bookshelf and did exactly what she'd agreed to do, which was not move, while Damien handled the space between them and the 2 men with the controlled violence of someone who understood leverage and physics and the particular geography of a room under pressure. One man went into the table. Glasses broke. The decanter hit the floor. The second man was larger and it took longer, and she watched Damien take a hit across the shoulder that turned him sideways, and she saw his face in that moment. Not the controlled stillness, not the recalibrating attention, but something raw and functional. The face of a person who is hurting and working anyway. The face of someone who has been here before. He put the second man down. He stood breathing hard. His shoulder dropped 2 inches lower than the other. He rolled it once, quickly, an inventory. The room was quiet. Whitmore hadn't moved. He was still in his chair. His composure was back, or the shell of it was. But his hands were very tight on the armrests, and his blue eyes were doing a rapid calculation she could see even from across the room. Charlotte stepped forward. Damien turned slightly. Not a warning, just the reflex of a man who'd spent the last 40 seconds making sure the room was safe. She met his eyes. He stepped aside. She walked to the table. She stood across from Edward Whitmore with the broken glass between them and the fire behind him, and she looked at him directly, the way she had looked at thousands of children over 14 years. Not with authority performed, but with authority inhabited, the authority of someone who is certain about what they know. She reached into her jacket and put the flash drive on the table. He looked at it. My father spent 2 years building what's on that drive, she said. Her voice was level, not loud. She didn't need loud. He did it quietly, in the hours around his real work, because he believed that if he documented it precisely enough, the right people would have to act. She paused. He knew he was putting himself at risk. He did it anyway. Whitmore said nothing. He was watching her with the blue eyes and the tightly gripped armrests. He called you a cost of doing business, she said. You said that. On video, in your own dining room, in your own voice. A man who spent 40 years being honest about other people's money. You called him a cost of doing business. The fire moved. The room held its breath. I want you to understand something, she said, before the people outside this house come in. I want you to understand it not because it changes anything legally. It doesn't. The evidence is already beyond your reach, and your lawyers will explain that to you in the next several hours. She paused. I want you to understand it because I think you've spent so long operating in a world where everything can be managed and everything has a price that you've stopped understanding what it means when something can't be. She picked up the flash drive, put it back in her pocket. My father couldn't be bought, she said, and neither can what he left. From outside, not the back of the house, the front, the surrounding grounds, a sound began, organized. Multiple vehicles, multiple doors, the kind of sound that has a specific shape when you know what you're listening for. Charlotte turned and looked at Damien. He looked back at her with an expression she hadn't seen before and couldn't fully name. Something that wasn't quite pride because it was quieter than that, and wasn't quite relief because it had too much weight. Something that acknowledged what she had just done and understood its full dimension. He nodded. Once. She nodded back. The library door opened. Not the door behind them, the main door, the one they'd entered through. A man in a different suit, not Whitmore's staff. A suit that meant something federal. Behind him, two more. Edward Whitmore looked at the federal agent. Then he looked at the decanter on the floor, the broken glasses, the two men who would need assistance standing. He looked at Damien, he looked at Charlotte. He looked finally at his own hands on the armrests. He let go of them. Mr. Whitmore, the federal agent said, stepping fully into the room. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges, including— I know what the charges are, Whitmore said. His voice was still controlled. The old composure, its last outing. I've spent 30 years knowing what the charges would eventually be. Charlotte looked at him when he said that. She hadn't expected it. The honesty of it, bleak, unadorned, was the first real thing he'd said all evening. She thought about her father. She thought about the Thanksgiving hug. She thought about Arthur the dog who never existed, and the watch on her wrist that still kept precise time. She turned away from Edward Whitmore while the federal agent continued speaking, and she walked to the door and through it and into the hall. And then she stopped, her hand on the wall, and breathed. Her ribs ached, not from any physical impact, from the sustained tension of the last 2 days moving through her body all at once as the pressure released. Her legs were tired, her eyes burned. Damien came through the door behind her. She heard his footsteps stop close. She didn't turn around. Your shoulder, she said. It'll do, he said. She took her hand off the wall. She straightened. She turned. He was standing 3 feet away with his jacket partially torn at the shoulder seam, his hair slightly disordered, breathing at a pace that told her he was managing pain. He wasn't going to mention unless she asked specifically. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the hallway was very quiet with all the activity somewhere behind them and the house settling around the weight of what had just happened inside it. She said, he's going to try to deal. Tomorrow morning, with his lawyers, he's going to try to minimize and deal and make it as small as possible. Yes, Damien said. It won't work. No. She looked at him steadily. Because of the video. Because of everything your father built. He paused. And because of Victor's testimony. And because of what's already in New York. And because the people connected to Whitmore are going to start talking the moment their own lawyers explain the weight of the evidence against them. He paused again. 50 years of purchased loyalty collapses quickly when the price becomes too high. Outside, through the manor's tall windows, she could see the lights, federal vehicles, organized in the long driveway, their presence unhurried and total. The gate she'd come through an hour ago was no longer the kind of gate that opened from the inside. She felt the watch on her wrist, the second hand moving. Her father had worn it 20 years and given it to her without explanation on an afternoon 3 years ago when he'd known, some part of him had known, that time was becoming finite. She'd thought, wearing it these 4 months, that she was carrying his memory. She understood now she'd been carrying his work. Both things. Both things in the same object on the same wrist. "Brandon," she said. Damien's expression shifted slightly. "He's going to lose everything," she said. Not with satisfaction, not with grief, just as a fact. The company, the name, whatever he thought he'd inherit from his father's life. Yes. "He didn't know," she said, "about my father. I don't think he knew." She paused. "He's not a good person, but the specific evil that killed my father, I don't think that was Brandon." "No," Damien said. "Brandon Whitmore is a man who didn't want to know what was underneath things. That's not the same." "No," she agreed. "It's not." They stood in the hallway while the federal operation organized itself around Edward Whitmore's arrest and the dismantling of 50 years of managed consequence, and Charlotte thought about what came next. Not the legal process, not the public revelation, those were already set in motion, but the personal next. The boxes in her car that she still hadn't carried inside. The coffee mug on the assistant's desk that she'd need to collect. The classroom full of second graders who were going to come back from winter break and need someone present and functional and sure of what the day's lesson was. She thought about all of that. She thought, I can do all of that. Damien shifted beside her just slightly, adjusting his weight off the damaged shoulder. She noticed without looking. She was beginning to learn the peripheral language of him, the small adjustments he thought no one saw. "We should go," he said. "In a minute," she said. She looked down the hall at the lit rooms, the federal agents moving through them, the house that had held 50 years of secrets being walked through by people with warrants and evidence bags, and the particular authority of institutions that had been slow to arrive and were now comprehensively present. 1 minute. She gave herself 1 minute. Then she turned and walked toward the door, and Damien walked beside her. And outside the night was cold and clear, and the vehicles in the driveway were numerous, and the gate at the end of the long drive was open in the direction she was going, and she walked through it without looking back at the house, and her father's watch kept perfect time on her wrist, and the second hand moved the way it always moved, forward, only forward, without pause or accommodation for anything that had already happened. They were in the car before either of them spoke again. "It's not over," she said. "The legal process. It'll be months. Years, possibly," he said. "And your organization." She looked at him. "What happens to it?" He looked at the road ahead. His jaw was set, but not tight. The set of someone who has thought about a question for a long time and arrived, finally, at an answer. "It changes," he said. "It's already changing. Has been." He paused. "What I built. Some of it I'm not proud of. Most of it I can live with. The parts I can't, I've been walking those back for 2 years. Because of my father." A pause. "Because of my own accounting," he said. "Your father just accelerated the timeline." She looked at him for a long moment in the moving car. At the worn quality of him tonight, the shoulder, the controlled exhaustion he was managing, the photograph of his father shaking hands with her father that was still on the table in the North Shore house. "You're not what I expected," she said. He glanced at her. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something harder, something simpler." She paused. "Something that would be easier to distrust." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Is that a problem?" She considered the question. Outside, Chicago reassembled itself as they drove south. The suburbs thinning, the city thickening, the lights multiplying, the specific density of a place that had been secretly hosting 2 versions of itself for decades, the one you saw and the one underneath it that her father had found and documented and died to expose. "No," she said, "it's not a problem." The car moved through the city. Damien's shoulder sat 2 inches lower than the other. Charlotte's hands were in her lap and were steady. The watch kept time. Somewhere behind them, in a manor at the end of a long driveway, Edward Whitmore was being read his rights in a library with a broken decanter on the floor, and 50 years of purchase certainty was coming apart at its seams, and the man who had ordered her father's death was discovering, At 72, the specific weight of a consequence that could not be managed. The car reached the highway and accelerated, and the city fell away on both sides, and Charlotte looked straight ahead and thought, "Dad, we got there." She pressed her thumb to the face of the watch. The second hand moved and did not stop. The news broke at 6:17 in the morning. Charlotte was awake when it did. She'd been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen table in the North Shore house with a second cup of coffee going cold beside her, watching the darkness outside the window give way to the early gray of a November dawn. She heard Marcus come downstairs first, then the sound of his laptop opening, then a silence that had a specific quality, the silence of someone reading something that was confirming what they already knew. He came to the kitchen doorway. "It's out," he said. She nodded. He brought his laptop to the table and turned it so she could see. The headline was not subtle. Headlines about things like this never were. Whitmore Group patriarch arrested. Federal charges include racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, and murder. Beneath it, a photograph of Edward Whitmore that she recognized as his standard corporate headshot. Silver-haired, composed, the blue eyes direct and confident in the way they would never be confident again. She read the first 3 paragraphs. Then she stopped reading. She already knew all of it. She had lived all of it. Reading it arranged into news language felt strange, flattening somehow, the way journalism always flattened things into a shape that could be consumed quickly and then moved past. Her father's name was in the 4th paragraph. Forensic accountant Richard Hayes, whose death 14 months ago was ruled an accident, is now believed to have been the target of a coordinated murder ordered by Edward Whitmore after Hayes uncovered financial crimes spanning nearly 2 decades. Believed to have been. The language of institutional caution. Her father was dead and the headline said believed. She closed the laptop gently and pushed it back toward Marcus. "Thank you," she said. He took it and went back upstairs without another word, which was the right thing to do, and she was grateful for it. Damien came down 20 minutes later. He moved carefully, the shoulder wrapped now. Elena had done it the night before with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work before, and he poured coffee and came to the table and sat across from her. He looked at her face. "I read it," she said. "It's out." "Yes." He wrapped his hands around the mug. His eyes were tired in a way she hadn't seen before, the tired of someone who had been braced for a long time, and the bracing had finally become unnecessary, and the body was now registering what that cost. The New York prosecutor called at 5. The Chicago warrants are fully executed. They arrested 9 people overnight in addition to Whitmore, the federal investigator on the video. He paused. He was arrested at his home at 3 in the morning. Charlotte thought about that, about the man in the video nodding while Edward Whitmore described her father as a problem, about the official correspondence she'd received after her father's death, the letters she'd been too destroyed to read carefully, signed with the name of the man who'd agreed to make him a problem that didn't exist anymore. "Good," she said. The word came out plain, no satisfaction in it, no particular heat, just the simple, accurate response to a fact. "The man who drove the car," Damien said. She looked at him. He was arrested at 2:45, at the Whitmore building, coming off a night shift. His voice was steady. "He'll be charged separately. Murder 1. Victor's testimony puts him at the location, and there's additional evidence from the documentation your father compiled. He'd tracked the vehicle registration, the timeline, the route deviation. He built the case against the man who killed him." A pause. "Posthumously." Charlotte set her coffee mug down. She pressed both palms flat on the table. She breathed. Her father had known. He'd tracked the threat all the way to its edges, documented it, built a case so complete that it convicted his own murderer from the other side of his death. Richard Hayes, forensic accountant, precise and thorough to the absolute end, had looked at the evidence of his own danger and treated it the way he treated everything, methodically, completely, with the conviction that documentation was the most honest form of truth-telling available to him. She thought about him at the kitchen table with his legal pads. She thought about the wristwatch. She thought about the lockbox with her birthday combination and the 4th folder locked behind the name of a dog named Arthur. She thought, he knew I'd find it. He built the combination knowing I was the one who'd come looking. She pressed her thumb to the watch face. The second hand moved. "Charlotte," Damien said. She looked up. He was watching her with the full weight of his attention, the specific qualities she'd come to understand over the past 3 days, as the way he looked at things he considered important and didn't want to misread. The legal process from here, he said. It will be long, months before the trials, possibly years for all of it to fully resolve. The prosecutors will need testimony from you, not just Victor. They'll want Richard's daughter on record about the evidence, how you found it, the chain of custody. He paused. It won't be quiet. Not for a while. I know. The press will find you, probably today. I know that too. He held her gaze. Is there anything you need, right now, today? She thought about it genuinely, not rhetorically. What she actually needed, standing on the other side of the longest 3 days of her life, with her father's evidence in federal hands and his murder in federal custody and the second hand moving on the watch. I need to go home, she said. I need to carry the boxes in from my car. I need to call my mother and sit with her and explain everything she doesn't know yet, which is most of it. She paused. And I need to be back in my classroom on Monday. My kids are coming back from winter break and they're going to need someone present. He nodded. And I need to know, she said more quietly, what happens with you. The kitchen was very still. Damien looked at his coffee, then at her. The thing she'd noticed in the car the night before, the worn quality of him, the openness that exhaustion produced, was still there in the morning light, slightly different, but not gone. My organization is cooperating fully with the federal investigation into Whitmore's network, he said. There will be a period of significant restructuring. Some of what we've done intersects with things that will need to be examined. He said it carefully, not evasively, like a man reading a document accurately rather than managing an impression. I'm not going to tell you that's simple or that it resolves cleanly. It doesn't. Are you going to be arrested? No. He paused. My Washington contact has been working with me for 6 years. What I've provided over that time, information, access, cooperation on parallel investigations, it creates a particular kind of relationship. He paused again. It's not immunity. It's history. A useful history. The Moretti organization is becoming something else. He said it with the flatness of a fact rather than the warmth of a promise. Has been for 2 years. This accelerates it. A pause. I told you that in the car. I meant it. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning light. The photograph of their father shaking hands was still upstairs on the table in the room where she'd slept. 2 men who had found each other through the specific gravity of a city's hidden architecture, who had shaken hands over something she'd never know the full details of, whose children had ended up in this kitchen at 6:40 in the morning on the day the world found out what Richard Hayes had died to expose. She said, You're going to have to do something about Victor. He nodded. I know. Not punishment. I already said he's more valuable testifying, but you can't. She stopped, found the precise shape of what she meant. You can't keep him close. Whatever he meant to you, whatever the history is, the version of it that existed before is not the version that's left. No, Damien said, it's not. That's going to cost you something. He looked at her steadily. Most of the things worth doing cost something. She held his gaze. Then she picked up her mug and finished the coffee, cold as it was. Victor Kane left Chicago 11 days later. Charlotte was not present for whatever conversation happened between him and Damien in the interim, but she saw the result of it in Damien's face when he mentioned it. A contained quality, a careful flatness, the expression of a man who had said something definitive and was living in the aftermath of having said it. Victor had given full testimony to the federal prosecutors. His daughter's legal situation had been reviewed independently and resolved through legitimate process rather than through favors, which Victor had requested specifically, insisting on it in a way that Damien had told Charlotte about with a kind of reluctant respect. He wanted it clean, Damien had said. At the end, he wanted at least that much clean. She'd said, that doesn't fix it. He'd said, no, it doesn't. The press found Charlotte on the afternoon of the first day, which was exactly when Damien had predicted. A reporter from the Tribune called her cell phone. She didn't know how they got the number and later found out it was a former student's parent who'd seen the news and helpfully connected some dots without being asked. She declined the call and every subsequent call for 2 weeks. She'd been advised by the federal prosecutors to limit media contact until after her testimony was on record, and she used that instruction as a clean reason not to have conversations she wasn't ready for. She carried the boxes from her car on the second day, took them up to her apartment 3 trips, set them in the second bedroom, and closed the door. She wasn't ready to open them yet. But they were inside, which was different from being in the car. It was an increment. She was learning to count increments. She sat with her mother on the third day, at the kitchen table in the house she'd grown up in, and explained everything. It took 4 hours. Her mother listened with a stillness that Charlotte recognized as the family's particular version of composure, the hazed composure, learned, chosen, the ability to hold very large and very painful things without spilling them. Her mother cried once, briefly, when Charlotte described the video. The sound her mother made was small and then gone, compressed back into the stillness, but it sat in the room for a long time after. When Charlotte finished, her mother was quiet for a while. Then she said, "He told me once that he was working on something that mattered. He said that in the way he said things when he meant more than the words." She paused. "I knew not to ask." "You weren't scared?" Charlotte said. "I was terrified," her mother said simply. "Every single day. But he was doing what he had to do, and I understood that, and there wasn't anything else to say about it." Charlotte looked at her mother across the kitchen table. She saw, in the set of her mother's shoulders and the particular way she held her coffee cup, a woman who had spent 2 years carrying something enormous and had carried it without showing the weight of it, and Charlotte felt a complicated love for her. Not the simple love of childhood, but the harder love of seeing someone completely and choosing them anyway. "He left me the watch," Charlotte said. "I know," her mother said. "He agonized about whether to give it to you." A small pause. "I told him you'd figure it out." Charlotte went back to her classroom on Monday. She walked in at 7:15, 40 minutes before the students arrived, and stood in the middle of the room, in the particular quiet of empty classrooms. That specific stillness that smelled like dry erase markers and construction paper and the accumulated presence of hundreds of children who had sat in those small chairs and learned things. She stood there and looked at the reading corner, the alphabet border along the top of the whiteboard, the window with its 7 paper snowflakes made in December that were still taped up because she hadn't been there to take them down. She took them down now. Carefully, one by one, not tearing them, folded them, set them on her desk. Then she uncapped a marker and wrote the date on the board. January 8th. She stood back and looked at it. January 8th. Her father had been dead for 5 months. Edward Whitmore was in federal custody. The man who drove the car was in federal custody. The financial empire that had laundered enough money to fund a generation of corrupt public officials was unwinding through 100 different legal proceedings that would take years to fully resolve. The city of Chicago was doing what cities do with things that are too large and too shameful to process quickly. Talking about it in some quarters, not talking about it in others, and in certain places feeling something like relief. The particular relief of a thing that everyone knew was wrong, being named and addressed at last. 23 second graders came through the door at 8 o'clock. They were loud and disorganized, and several of them had new Christmas gifts they wanted to talk about. And one of them, Marcus, not that Marcus, a different Marcus, 7 years old with a gap in his front teeth and an earnestness she'd loved all year, came directly to her desk and said, "Ms. Hayes, we watched the news at my house, and my mom said you did something very brave." Charlotte looked at him. "Your mom's right that it was complicated," she said carefully. "And I had a lot of help." She paused. "Okay, let's start. Everybody find their seat." They found their seats. The day started. She taught them. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She'd spent 14 years being good at it, and the past 5 months had not changed that, had not diminished the specific pleasure of watching a child understand something for the first time. The light that moved across a child's face when a word became readable, when a number became a concept, when something that had been strange and frightening became known. She lived in those moments. She had always lived in them. She had not understood until the past week that her father had also lived in that place, the place where something hidden became known, where the truth of a thing became visible through careful attention. They were not so different. She had just never had occasion to see it until now. Brandon Whitmore called her on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after the arrest. She was in her car in the school parking lot, engine running for heat, grading papers on the steering wheel because she hadn't gotten to them the night before. She saw his name on the phone and sat with it for a moment. Then she answered. He sounded terrible. Not dramatically terrible. Not the theatrical devastation of someone performing suffering, but the flat, wrecked quality of someone who had not slept in weeks and had been sitting in lawyers' offices every day and had watched his family name become a noun associated with a specific category of human failure. "I didn't know," he said. It was the first thing he said before hello, before anything else. "About your father. Charlotte, I need you to know that." "I know," she said. A pause. "You know? You're a lot of things, Brandon. You're arrogant, and you're careless about how your carelessness affects people, and you spent 3 years with me without ever really seeing me." She kept her voice even. "But you didn't know. I could see that in your face at the party. The thing you were afraid of when Damien walked in. You weren't afraid because you knew what your father did. You were afraid because you didn't know what was underneath your family, and in that moment you understood the underneath existed." A long silence. "I looked the other way," he said. "For years. I saw things that didn't add up, and You told yourself a story," she said. "People do that. It doesn't absolve you. But it's different from knowing." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had a crack in it, just one, quickly controlled. "He was a good man. Your father. I knew him a little. When you and I met him twice. He was kind to me, and I didn't deserve it." A pause. "I don't know why I'm telling you that. I think you're telling me because it's true, and you needed to say it to someone who would understand what it meant," she said. She heard him breathe. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, probably." She looked at the papers on her steering wheel. A drawing of a dog. One of her students had written a story about a dog for journal time and illustrated it with a golden retriever that looked more like a yellow cloud with legs. She looked at it. "Brandon," she said, "go find a lawyer you actually trust. Not a Whitmore family lawyer. Someone independent. And then do what they tell you to do. And be honest. And don't look away from anything." She paused. "That's the only thing left you can control." "Is that what you'd do?" "It's what my father would do," she said. "Go." She hung up. She sat for a moment looking at the yellow cloud dog on the paper. Then she picked up her red pen and wrote at the bottom of the page, in her teacher's careful script, "Great storytelling. Your dog sounds wonderful," and set it in the stack. Damien called that same evening, which she didn't know was going to become the pattern it became. Him calling in the evenings, her answering, the two of them talking about things that were not always related to the case, finding their way through conversation into the odd territory of two people who had been through something enormous together and were now learning whether they had anything to say to each other in the quiet on the other side of it. They did. That surprised her less than she expected. He called to tell her that the federal prosecutors had completed her testimony review. She'd given 8 hours of recorded testimony over 3 sessions in the preceding weeks, and that it was fully accepted into the evidentiary record. Her description of finding the lockbox, the chain of custody from the flash drive to Marcus to the secure upload, her identification of her father's handwriting on the note, the password, the photograph, all of it on record, signed and certified, part of the official case that would go to trial. "It's real now," she said. "It was always real," Damien said. "I mean, it's official real, document real, the kind of real that can't be quietly revised later." She paused. "That's what my father was always working toward, that kind of real." "Yes," he said. She could hear in his voice that he was somewhere quiet. Not the safe house, not the North Shore house. He'd moved out of both after the first week, back to wherever he actually lived, which she didn't know the address of and hadn't asked. The Moretti organization's transition was ongoing. She knew this in broad strokes, knew that several operations had been formally shut down, that others had been restructured under legitimate corporate frameworks, that the process involved lawyers and federal liaisons and a level of institutional complexity she didn't fully understand and was honest with herself about not fully understanding. She knew that he was doing it, that it was real. That was what she could know right now. "There's something I want to tell you," he said. She waited. "The man who drove the car, his name is Gerald Purcell. He's been charged. He'll be tried separately from Whitmore, which the prosecutors say is standard in cases with multiple defendants where the charges differ in degree. A pause. They believe they have sufficient evidence for conviction without your testimony, but they may call you. She absorbed that. Gerald Purcell. She had known the name was coming at some point. She'd asked Damien in the car, the night it ended, and he'd told her the man was in custody, but she hadn't known the name then. Gerald Purcell. A name that was ordinary. A name that did not fit what it had done. Okay, she said. If they call you, you'll know who you're looking at when you walk into that courtroom. I know who I'm looking at now, she said. That doesn't change anything about what I'll say. A pause. No, he said. It wouldn't. She looked out her apartment window at the street below. January in Chicago. The specific austerity of the city in deep winter. The bare trees, the pale sky, the people moving fast on the sidewalk with their shoulders up. The particular stubborn life of a city that accepted the cold as the cost of existing here and paid it every year without renegotiating. She had lived here her whole life. She had thought she knew it. Damien, she said. Yes. My father's name is going to be in the public record, officially. As the whistleblower, as the accountant who built the case, as the person who… She stopped. Started again. They're going to say his name in courtrooms. It's going to be in documents, in news coverage, for years. Yes, he said quietly. That's what he wanted. Not the attention, not the recognition, just… She pressed her thumb to the watch. The truth in an official place. Documented. Real. That's what he built, Damien said. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said, for finishing it. We finished it, he said. The correction was immediate, without emphasis, as if it were simply the accurate version of what she'd said. She thought about arguing. She didn't, because he was right, and she had learned in the past weeks to let him be right when he was right, the same way he let her be right when she was, which was also a pattern that had established itself without announcement. They talked for another hour. She told him about Marcus with the gap teeth and the news story, and the way children absorbed massive events through small, specific details. He told her about a meeting with his transition attorneys that had gone better than expected, and described one of the lawyers with a dry precision that made her laugh. A real laugh. The kind that was slightly undignified, that she didn't bother containing. He seemed to like the sound of it. She could tell without being able to see his face. February came. The trial date for Edward Whitmore was set. March brought testimony from Victor Kane, delivered in federal court, that was covered extensively and reported thoroughly, and that contained in its details the full narrative of how a man had allowed fear for his daughter to become a mechanism for corruption, and had lived inside that mechanism for 18 months before finding his way back to something he could recognize as himself. Charlotte read the coverage. She did not attend the proceedings. She didn't need to. She went instead to the federal building on a Tuesday in late February when Gerald Purcell's separate trial began. She sat in the gallery. She wore her father's watch. She sat through 2 hours of opening statements from both prosecution and defense, and she looked at the man at the defense table, slight, 50s, brown hair going gray, with the look of a man who had decided the best strategy was to look like no one in particular, and she held her own stillness with both hands. Gerald Purcell looked at the gallery once during the opening statements. His eyes moved across the rows of faces with the blankness of someone who had coached themselves not to make eye contact. They passed over Charlotte. Then they came back. He looked at her. She looked at him. She didn't perform anything. She didn't project anything. She just looked at him with the full weight of knowing who he was and what he'd done and what her father had built specifically to ensure this moment existed, and she held the look for exactly as long as she chose to hold it. He looked away first. She left after the opening statements. She'd seen what she needed to see. She got in her car and drove, and she did not cry in the car, which she'd thought she might. Instead, she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not peace. That word was too thin for this, too placid. Something heavier. Something that acknowledged the scale of the cost and the scale of the result, and refused to pretend either one was anything other than exactly what it was. She called her mother from the parking garage. I went today, she said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. How was it? Hard, Charlotte said, and necessary. She paused. I think I understand now why Dad didn't tell us about it until he couldn't not tell us. Because once you see something, you can't unsee it, and he didn't want us to have to carry it. He carried too much alone, her mother said. Yes, Charlotte said. He did. But he was also, it was his way of protecting us. It was wrong, and it was also love. She pressed her thumb to the watch. Both things at once. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He would be proud of you." Charlotte did not trust her voice for a moment. She waited until she did. "I know," she said. "I know he would." Spring came slowly the way it always did in Chicago, grudgingly, in increments, the cold releasing its hold a degree at a time, as if reluctant to acknowledge that it was required to eventually do so. Charlotte noticed it in the way she always noticed seasonal change, through her students, who began arriving in lighter jackets, and then no jackets, and then with an energy that was specifically spring energy, a restlessness that was also joy, the body's animal understanding that the world was opening again. She noticed it in herself too. The boxes in the second bedroom. She opened them in March on a Sunday morning with coffee, taking her time, going through her father's things with the specific attention she now understood he'd always deserved from her. His professional journals, meticulous, precise, cross-referenced. His personal notebooks, which were less organized and more human, full of asides and observations, and a running list of books he wanted to read that went back 15 years. A photograph of her at age 9, gap-toothed, in front of a tree she recognized as the one in his parents' backyard. On the back, in his handwriting, "See, age 9, best day." She held that photograph for a long time. She put it on the shelf in the second bedroom, which was becoming something. She wasn't sure yet what, but something other than a place for boxes. She and Damien had dinner for the first time in April. Not as a strategy session, not as part of anything operational or necessary. Just dinner at a restaurant she'd suggested in her neighborhood, a small Italian place she'd been going to for years, loud and warm, with checkered tablecloths and a proprietor named Gino, who called everyone by name and had never once asked what anyone did for work. Damien came in his own car without bodyguards, which she noticed and didn't remark on. He sat across from her and looked at the menu and ordered the wrong thing based on her mild expression, and then she told him he'd ordered the wrong thing and pointed to the right thing, and he switched without argument. They talked for 3 hours. She told him things she hadn't told anyone since her father died. The way the first month had felt like being underwater, the specific wrongness of going to the grocery store and filling a basket when the world had become fundamentally unreal. He listened the way he did everything, with full and specific attention, not rushing to respond, not performing sympathy, just holding space for what she was saying and letting it be what it was. He told her things that surprised her, about his father, not the public version of the Moretti name, but the private one, the man in the photograph with his hand extended and a warmth in his face she'd recognized even in a small image. About learning a business that operated in the spaces where legitimate structures failed and the costs that extracted over time, not in the dramatic ways but in the cumulative ones. About the 2 years of dismantling, of choosing each day to move in a direction that cost him in the short term, and he hoped built something different in the long run. "Do you think it works?" she asked. "The building. Whatever you're trying to build." He considered it. "I think the doing is the answer," he said. "You don't know if it works until it's been built long enough to see, but the doing is still the answer." She thought about that. About her father's 2 years of documentation in the margins of his work. About 14 years of classrooms. About the doing being the answer. "Yeah," she said. "I think that's right." The dinner became a pattern. Tuesday evenings, sometimes Thursdays. The Italian place usually, sometimes elsewhere. She learned in increments the texture of who he was outside of crisis. Quieter, with a dry specificity of observation that surfaced as humor when he let it. With gaps in his knowledge of ordinary civilian life that she filled in sometimes to his mild bewilderment. He had not, for example, been in a grocery store in approximately 4 years. She found this extraordinary. He found her finding it extraordinary, somewhat extraordinary in return. She met Elena again, formally, at a small gathering at Damien's now-revealed home in Lincoln Park. A brownstone, 3 stories. The kind of place that had been lived in for a long time and showed it, with books and worn furniture and a kitchen that functioned seriously. Elena ran, Charlotte came to understand, the operational logistics of Damien's life, with the same practical authority she'd recognized in that first North Shore house. Elena approved of Charlotte in the way competent people approve of other competent people, practically, without performance. Roca she already knew. Marcus, the original Marcus, the man with the laptop and the two phones, she saw occasionally when something needed to be organized. They were not family, exactly. They were something adjacent to it, with the specific texture of people who had chosen each other through circumstances and found the choice held. Edward Whitmore's trial ran for 11 weeks. Charlotte testified on week 4, 2 days on the stand, direct examination and cross. The defense lawyer was excellent, and she was steady. She answered what she was asked. She did not editorialize. She did not cry. On the second day, during a break, she stepped out into the hallway and sat on a bench and pressed her thumb to the watch face and breathed. A woman she didn't know sat down next to her, middle-aged. She had the specific look of someone who had also been going through something difficult and was in the same building for the same reason. "Witness?" the woman asked. "Yes," Charlotte said. "Me too." A pause. "Whitmore case?" "Yes." The woman nodded. "My husband was on the city council. He's been cooperating." She said it without emotion. 11 years of dinners with those people, and I told him every year something was wrong, and he told me I was imagining things. Charlotte looked at her. "You weren't imagining things." "No," the woman said. "I wasn't." They sat for a moment in the hallway outside the courtroom, two people with nothing in common except the shape of what had happened around them. Then Charlotte's name was called, and she went back in. The verdict came in June. Guilty on all 23 counts. She heard about it by phone while standing in her classroom after the students had gone, arranging chairs for the next day. She stood still for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she set the phone down and finished arranging the chairs. She went home and called her mother. They talked for an hour. Her mother made a sound when Charlotte told her the verdict that was not quite crying and not quite not. The sound of something long held finally releasing. Charlotte sat on her apartment floor after the call, back against the couch, and let herself feel the size of it. The 17 months from her father's death to this moment. The 2 years before that of his quiet work. All the way back to the morning 3 years ago when he'd taken the wristwatch off his arm and pressed it into her hand, and she'd asked why, and he'd said, "Just keep it safe." She understood all of it now, the shape of it from beginning to end. She turned the watch over in her hands. The worn leather strap. The small scratch along the case. The second hand moving, steady and indifferent and forward. She put it back on. She and Damien were married in September, 11 months after the night of Diane's engagement party. Not at the Blackstone Hotel. Not in Chicago at all, in the end. They drove 4 hours on a Friday morning and were married that evening in a county courthouse in a small town in southern Wisconsin, in a room with wood paneling and fluorescent lighting and a justice of the peace named Mavis, who had been doing this for 30 years and treated the ceremony with the brisk tenderness of someone who understood it mattered without needing it to be theatrical. There were 6 people present, Charlotte's mother, holding her hands in her lap, very still, very composed. Her father's absence present in the room, the way his absence was present everywhere. Not as a wound anymore, not exactly, but as a shape. A known shape that Charlotte had learned to recognize and carry. Elena and Roca, who had driven up separately and arrived exactly on time. Marcus with the gap teeth, who was not supposed to be there, and absolutely was. His mother had texted Charlotte 2 weeks ago to say he'd somehow found out about the wedding and asked if he could come. And Charlotte had said yes because she was incapable of saying no to that particular request. He sat in the 3rd row in a clip-on tie and looked extremely serious about the whole proceeding. And the photographer Charlotte's mother had insisted on. One person, small camera, unobtrusive. Charlotte had said no photographs, and her mother had said, "Charlotte, Marie Hayes, you will want photographs." And Charlotte had looked at her mother's face and understood that this was not a debate. The ceremony was 14 minutes long. Mavis had a warm, direct voice and did not embellish. When Damien said "I do," he said it the way he said everything, without excess directly, holding Charlotte's eyes with the full weight of his attention. She had learned in 11 months to read the full dimensions of that attention. She knew what it meant when it was there completely. She said "I do" and meant it with the specific weight of a woman who understood that meaning something and being certain were not the same as knowing the future, and that the not knowing was not the part that mattered. He put a ring on her finger. She put one on his. Mavis said, "You may kiss your wife." He kissed her once, quiet, real, nothing performed. Marcus with the Gap, teeth said yes under his breath from the third row. They drove back to Chicago that night. She fell asleep in the passenger seat somewhere south of the Wisconsin border, which she hadn't intended to do and didn't remember doing, and woke up when the car stopped and recognized the street outside her apartment building. She looked over at Damien, who was watching her wake up with the expression she'd come to know as his version of warmth. Not demonstrative, not arranged, just there, present, the thing underneath the control when the control wasn't necessary. "Home," he said. "Home," she agreed. She got out of the car into the September night. Chicago was doing what it did in September, holding the last of the summer warmth reluctantly, knowing what was coming, keeping the air just slightly softer than it had any right to be at this hour. The street was quiet, a few windows lit, a dog somewhere in the middle distance. She looked up at her building. Third floor. The window she'd stood at 1,000 times looking out at this same street. She'd lived here 8 years. It was small, and it needed new kitchen fixtures, and the heat came on late every October, and she knew every sound it made in every season. It was hers. That was enough. She felt Damien's hand briefly at her back, the same light contact he'd used to guide her in the ballroom 11 months ago, the gesture that had registered as safe before she knew anything about him. She was still slightly surprised by her own body's memory of things. She looked at him. "You're thinking about something," he said. "I'm thinking about my dad," she said, "that he would like you. I didn't know that for a long time, but I think he would." Damien was quiet for then. He already did. She thought about that, about the photograph upstairs on the second bedroom shelf now, the one from the lockbox, their fathers shaking hands, her father's smile, the world being small in ways you didn't know until you were inside it. "Yeah," she said, "I think that's right." She went inside. She carried the day's accumulated weight up 3 flights of stairs and set it down in the kitchen and made tea, which she'd been making every night since she was a child, which her father had also made every night, which was one of those small, heritable habits she'd never examined until it became one of the last ordinary things she had of him. She carried the tea to the window and stood looking down at the street. The watch was on her wrist. The second hand moved. The city moved around it, indifferent and specific, full of people in lit windows carrying their own accumulated weight through their own quiet evenings. Richard Hayes had spent 2 years documenting the truth of what people were capable of, the worst of it, the organized machinery of greed and harm. He had done it alone, at night, in the margins of his legitimate work, because he believed that documentation was the most honest form of resistance available to him. He had been killed for it. And from the other side of his death, the documentation had continued doing exactly what he'd built it to do. Truth did not require the person who found it to survive the finding. Charlotte pressed her thumb to the watch face. The second hand moved. Outside, September held the warmth a little longer. The street was quiet. Somewhere in the city, in a federal detention facility, Edward Whitmore slept with the weight of 23 convictions, and Gerald Purcell waited for his own trial date, and 47 names on a list were working through various stages of legal consequence. Somewhere in an apartment she didn't know, Victor Kane was living a reduced life in the direction of something she chose to believe was honest. Somewhere in this apartment, her husband was moving through the unfamiliar geography of a home that was becoming shared. Charlotte drank her tea. She thought about Monday's lesson plan. She thought about Marcus with the gap teeth and his golden retriever story and the yellow cloud dog with legs, and the particular way he'd said yes under his breath in the courthouse in Wisconsin with his clip-on tie and his absolute conviction that this was a moment worth being present for. She thought about her father, who had given her a watch without explanation and trusted her to figure out why. She thought, "I figured it out, Dad." The tea was warm, the window was cold at the edges, the city went about its life below. She watched it. She was part of it. She had always been part of it, even when she hadn't known what it contained. She finished the tea and rinsed the mug and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The second hand moved. Forward, only forward, without accommodation for anything that had already happened.